of our show for today. We're talking to Dr. Madu, and the topic is commercial and business investments in Africa. Dr. Madu, I think you were talking about some of the areas of social concern in reference to investing in Africa. Let's continue our discussion.
And the third obstacle, I've mentioned the first two, which is corruption, absence of data. The third obstacle is, a lot of the business is relational. Like I said, personalized in a lot of ways. And that can create a lot of problems, when your business interest is hinged on the person you're dealing with, not on the entity, they run or so. So that can be a problem. And the fourth problem here, which is very big, and most people don't understand it, is in French-speaking African countries. What most people don't understand, a lot of the problems in dealing with French-speaking Africa, or what we call Francophone Africa, is that most of the commercial and business, interests are controlled by the French up to today. For example, 65% of the foreign reserve of all the French-speaking countries in Africa has to be deposited in the bank treasury in France. And then that 10%, again, plus 10%, that's what you get about 75% there altogether. And that 10% of what they call for financial liability. All this has to be deposited by all the French-speaking African countries in
French bank.
Exactly, in the bank in Paris, without fail. So if you're doing business in those countries...
That's still the old colonial system. I mean, I think earlier you talked about some issues in Haiti, and one of the reasons that Haiti was in such a terrible situation financially is that it's still paying reparations.
That's correct. That's correct.
Speak of those are similar kinds of issues.
Exactly. So this is just kind of indirect. Indirect, exactly. So 65% of their foreign reserves have to be deposited in the French banks. Okay? Their currency, none of those French-speaking African countries has an independent currency. Their currency, called the CFA franc, is tied to the French franc. Okay, so that if there are any changes or turbulence in the French economy, all those Francophone African countries will start sneezing and coughing. Okay. So what happens here is that all the minerals and all that are controlled directly by the French. By the French. Okay, so this is a big obstacle to doing business. And why? Because if you're if you're an American business or British business or Chinese, and you want to do business in those countries, the French can stop you from going in there. And they do it quite often.
They can literally stop you from becoming involved in investments
in those countries. So absolutely. Oh yeah, they have a lot of ways of doing it. Yeah, like in the Ivory Coast, they control everything there. The Ivory Coast. You saw how they removed Gbagbo. Okay, yeah, they control everything in the Ivory Coast, Mali, Burkina Faso. 50% or 60% or 70% of their budget comes from France, and that's why France wants this money deposited in their own bank, so they will use it, to balance the budget of these countries. All the minerals, the French, have firm control over those minerals in the French-speaking African countries. I have a, example. I have a direct, conflict with one of the French-speaking countries in the early 90s. One day, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the Central African Republic, called me on the phone here and said he had my name on Radio Bangui, in Central African Republic, that I was coming to the country to meet with President Patase at the palace, So I said, no, he's supposed to be coming here, not me going there. Yeah, he's supposed to come here with his entourage, not me. So I said, okay, can you get me a communique in their newspaper, because if you announce something on the radio, one word or the other, it should be in the paper. So can you get me that article in the paper? So he said, they don't have a newspaper. So what do you mean by they don't have a newspaper? He said, well, they read Le Figaro and Le Monde, and all these are published, exactly published in France. I couldn't believe it. So when the ambassador came here, Dr. Koba, so I asked him this question. He said, it's true. I said, okay, why don't we do this? Why can't I arrange for a publishing company here to publish, a newspaper for your country every month? At least we start with 10 to 15,000 copies. You all do the, the writing there.
Okay.
Just
and then send it
down here, print it, and we ship it back there. So he said, that's a good idea, I will get back with you. So he went and talked with the Minister of Information and the palace, and came back to me and said, they said, no, they can't do it because the French wouldn't like it.
Wouldn't like it.
Yeah, exactly, wouldn't allow it. Because
and so France really has a veto power.
That's right.
Over all of the French-speaking. These were all countries that at one time were colonial holdings of the French.
That's correct. That's correct. That was why Sekou Touré, you know, had to quarrel with them. He refused to accept that kind of, you know, when de Gaulle, you know, said, okay, we'll give you independence, but this is what you have to do. Only Sekou Touré said, no way. And the French got mad and even took all the electric poles in Guinea when they left, you know, to punish them. Okay, so that's another obstacle. When you go into those countries to do business, the French has a way of stopping you because A, they do not want, you know, those countries to threaten their financial interests, and secondly, they do not want particular Anglophone countries, you know, like United States and Britain to have influence in those countries because of commercial reasons.
And so when we say that Africa is open for business, we're saying in a real sense in almost every section of Africa, with the exception of those areas that are controlled by colonial France. Is that what we're saying?
That's correct.
You can't expect to go there and be successful.
That's correct.
If the French don't want you to be successful.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's important for people to understand. You know, now you have the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, you know, having a whole lot of, you know, cuts in the African business. You know, today, China is the third largest, you know, trading partner of Africa. The United States still #1, the European Union #2, you know, China #3. And then you have Brazil coming in there, you have India coming in there. And of course, in order to counterbalance, you know, what you call the European domination of African business, you have what you call the BRIC countries today. That's Brazil, you know, Russia, India, and China. BRIC, B-R-I-C. These countries now have formed a bloc of their own, you know, to do business in Africa and other places to counterbalance, you know, the United States and European Union address, who've had a majority, you know, interest in African business. And recently, you know, they invited South Africa, you know, to become part of that, you know, group. For the last meeting they had in Beijing, you know, sometime last month, to the early part of this month, you know, South Africa was invited. And amongst those 4 countries, they're almost half of the world's population. And that's a very big market there. You know, China is about 1.3, 1.5 billion people. India is about 1 billion people. Brazil is almost 300.
And all of those countries could be open for investment.
That's correct. And those countries too are open for investment. They are called the emerging markets. You know, most of these African economies are called the frontier markets. That is countries that have, you know, the resources, but lack the political and economic stability. You know, they're frontier, you know, countries. So it's very important to understand that when you're going to Africa to do business, you know, you have to look at, you know, these French-speaking countries, you know, the Lusophone countries. That's the countries that were formerly, you know, a colony of Portugal. That they're Lusophone countries. Mozambique, you know, Cape Verde, Angola, you know, Guinea-Bissau. Then, of course, the Anglophone. And
so, in reality, over the last minute and a half we have here, is that these colonial countries are still financially as powerful as they were during the colonial days, and independence really has not impacted them at all. The fact that these countries are independent, is that what we're saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why they say that a lot of the African countries are independent on paper, you know, but in reality, you know, most of them are not, because a lot of their economies are still controlled by outside forces, indirectly.
And of course, you would encourage, or at least you would advise individuals who wish to be successful not to deal with those countries that are still financially controlled by the former mother countries.
Well, that would be stretching it, because I can say that 90% of the countries in Africa still have exactly a lot of their economies indirectly tied to former colonial powers.
But some more specifically than others.
That's correct. Some more, you know, apart from South Africa or Nigeria, you know, most of the other countries really still have a whole of dependence on their former colonial.
And of course, Dr. Madu, let me thank you for that information. Let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.